Hello, I'm Hannah Donnert with the Collaborative on Health and the Environment. Che enjoys bringing you the latest environmental health science through our partnership calls, webinars, science serves, publications, and social media. I would like to welcome everyone to today's Che EDC Strategies Partnership webinar, which is titled Distract, Dismiss, Delay, How Industries and Organizations Manufacture Doubt to the Detriment of Environmental Health. Our moderator today is Cheryl Patton, Director of the Commonweal Biomonitoring Resource Center. We will leave time following the presentation for a brief Q&A session. You may type in questions through the Q&A feature available on the menu bar at the top of your window at any point during the presentation. After the presentation, our moderator will read out questions for our speakers to respond to. We will get to as many comments and questions as we can during the Q&A period. For those of you who called in on the phone, we have posted slides to accompany today's webinar on our website. You can download these by going to healthandenvironment.org. Please scroll to the bottom of the page and select today's webinar. On the webinar page is a link to the slides. Everyone on the webinar right now is muted with the exception of our moderator and our speakers. This webinar is scheduled to last for 30 minutes and is being recorded for our call and webinar archive. With that, I'll turn things over to you, Cheryl.
Thanks very much, Hannah. And this is Cheryl Patton here from Commonweal, and I'm very much honored to be introducing Dr. Laura Vanderberg, who is an Associate Professor and Graduate Program Director in the Department of Environmental Health Sciences in the University of Massachusetts Amherst School of Public Health and Health Sciences. She's an outstanding researcher and a hero to many, including those of us who joined today's webinar and including myself. She's one of the leading voices in calling attention of regulators, health effective groups, manufacturers, and many others to the capacity of EDCs to disrupt human health and well-being. Her research explores how low doses of chemicals during critical windows of development can alter gene expression, cell differentiation, and tissue organization in very subtle ways that can lead to adult diseases such as cancer, obesity, and infertility. Her work also focuses on traditional toxicology assays have failed to identify a number of ubiquitous endocrine disruptors and how current risk assessment practices can be improved in the study and regulation of this class of chemicals. Today's talk will focus on the methods by which organizations and individuals have developed strategies and techniques to interfere with chemical regulations by creating doubt. Laura, I turn it over to you, and thank you for joining.
Thank you. It's so great to be here. And I'm going to try to give you an overview of two projects, or two really related projects that we've been working on here at UMass Amherst. As soon as my slides will advance. So this concept of manufactured doubt is something that my student Rebecca Goldberg and I have defined, because it's talked about by a lot of different experts and groups in different contexts, but we wanted to make sure that everyone's on the same page to start with. And we define it as actions that deliberately alter and misrepresent knowable facts and empirical evidence to promote an agenda, often to benefit a broader industry or a specific corporation or a group of individuals. And really this started with the tobacco industry. In fact, we know that the tobacco industry literally wrote a playbook of methods that could be used to prevent public health action against their product, or to delay public health action against their product. Starting in the 1950s, epidemiology studies were demonstrating that smokers have higher rates of cancer compared to non-smokers. In fact, the first classical study by Hammond and Horn showed that smokers have 52% more mortality than non-smokers, and that there was a linear dose response curve. So the heavier the smoker, the worse the consequences were for health. That was in the 1950s, and yet a lot of us have family, friends, loved ones that started smoking after the 1950s, and in some ways seemed unaware of the danger that smoking posed to them. In the 1960s, the US Surgeon General put together a committee, and several books have written about this committee and the work that was done, again, by the tobacco industry to influence who was allowed to sit on that committee. So any individual who had taken a strong stance against tobacco smoking was vetoed from membership on that committee. And in fact, most of the members of the committee were heavy smokers. And in spite of that, they drew a conclusion that there's a strong relationship between cigarette smoking and health, and that the strongest evidence came from lung cancer, but there was also very strong evidence linking cigarette smoking with heart disease. Many of you are probably familiar with this quote. This quote is what lent itself to Dr. David Michael's first book. And it comes from a tobacco industry document that was discovered during legal proceedings. And what's shocking here is that the tobacco industry was not claiming that tobacco or cigarettes or chewing tobacco, any specific product is what they were trying to sell. Instead, they point out that doubt is their product, and that doubt is the way to compete with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public. It's the means of establishing a controversy. So even in the 60s, people were having a sense that whether they understood the basic principles of epidemiology, it's not a stretch to people that putting a burning cigarette into your mouth is hazardous for you. And yet the industry was coming up with ways to compete with what seemed like the natural knowledge that existed at the time. Of course, we have to keep in mind that there are great incentives that industry has to manufacture doubt. In 2010, so these are now statistics that are 10 years old, the tobacco products for the 6 leading tobacco companies were worth $35 billion US. And so these are competing with other major corporations. The tobacco industry itself has a gross domestic product that's equivalent to fairly wealthy countries. And if you have not seen some of the old clips by John Oliver about the actions that big tobacco has used against small countries when they have tried to protect their public from smoking, a very simple YouTube or Google search will bring up some really excellent and entertaining truth and satire evaluations of the tactics that tobacco continues to use. So what my student Rebecca Goldberg and I decided to do was first to collect information about 5 distinct industries and the approaches that were used by those industries to manufacture doubt. Tobacco seems like the perfect place to start, but we also dug into links between the coal industry and black lung in people who work for that industry, links between the sugar industry and the consumption of sugar and how it leads to heart disease. The chemical ATRAZINE, which is an agrochemical typically sprayed on corn crops, and its ability to disrupt sexual development of amphibians and other creatures. And the Marshall Institute, which was actually a Cold War institute for many years. They studied and gave policy advice on the Cold War. And as concerns about the Cold War shifted, they found new jobs advocating against any activities related to climate change. We picked these 5 different industries because they are so different. And our goal was, number 1, to describe the background stories of these 5 industries, because a lot of people are unaware that these tactics and these approaches have been used over and over and over again by different industries, all of which have an impact on public health and environmental health. But we also wanted to use these 5 very different industries to see, is there something in common about the tactics that they use to manipulate public health decision making? So the very first step that we took was to tell these stories. And I just want to make it very clear that we are not the first to tell these stories, but we were trying to tell them for the academic environmental health sciences community, because a lot of them have been told very well in books that have been written by public health historians or science historians, or they've been told really well in the by investigative journalists. And so we wanted to start by just giving a summary of these 5 cases. And I believe that the CHE website has a link to this paper, but this is a place where we've reminded people in my field of study about these 5 different cases. Just a brief overview of those cases, the tobacco industry, one thing that they have gotten very good at is showing how difficult it can be to establish causal relationships. And how much data we really sort of expect as a society before we're willing to believe studies, especially when they don't involve control. So with smoking, we never identified a population and told them that they had to smoke so that we could compare them to a population that we told could not smoke. So everything has been done in by evaluating humans where we have not controlled their behaviors. And that allowed the tobacco industry to really push this question of what does it mean to establish a causal relationship. And they did that by just continuing to ask questions that moved the goalposts. The coal industry used some of those same tactics, but what was sort of unique and why we selected this industry is that they were very good at exploiting the legal system. And there's sort of a legal framework by which coal miners are allowed to request support for healthcare expenditures related to an occupational harm that has come to them. And the coal industry used their power and their influence and their financial resources to really shift the burden onto the employees, requiring them to demonstrate that they have black lung, which is very difficult to do. The sugar industry we selected, again, because this is a very powerful, financially stable industry, but it's an example of an industry that could reasonably cast blame on somebody else. And the sugar industry really did this by pointing towards foods that have high fat content and saying that it's not sugar that's responsible for heart disease, it's high fat content. And for a lot of us, that sort of makes sense. So it's easy to sort of stop looking deeply at them if there's another plausible cause. The story of ATRAZINE is really, again, a unique story that uses many of the same tactics, but here was a manufactured attempt to cast a single very strong voice, that of Dr. TYRONE Hayes, a professor at UC Berkeley, as a lone voice of dissent about the safety of ATRAZINE. And they really used methods to covertly attack Dr. Hayes, who they saw as an extremely vocal opponent, and in ways that felt very insidious, because it was easy to not believe him until a bunch of documents were turned over during the public discovery process in a lawsuit that made it clear that the things that Dr. Hayes had claimed had been happening to him, they had documented had actually been happening. And finally, the example of the Marshall Institute. This is a Cold War institute, and this is an example of experts who had expertise, strong expertise in one area where they felt that they were losing prestige and power and influence, decided to shift their work towards an entirely different area in which they had no real expertise. And they did that so that they and their institute could continue to be personally enriched and benefit, and to maintain proximity to decision makers in government. So after we evaluated, and we did this by reading primary literature, we read some excellent books like David Michael's book, Naomi Oreskes' book, a lot of the investigative journalism, and those resources are available on the CHE website. What we did next is to try to identify the distinct tactics that were used by different industries. So we identified 28 distinct tactics that could have been used by one of these industries. 5 of those tactics were used by all 5 of the industries. 6 of the tactics were used by all but one of the industries, and it's interesting for reasons maybe why one of the industries chose not to use one of them. 4 tactics are unique to specific industries, and I'll talk very briefly about that. 10 of these tactics, or at least 10 of them, rely on logical fallacies, which I'll also explain. And so ultimately, we think that these 28 tactics are used to target 4 distinct audiences. This is work that Rebecca Goldberg and I have submitted for publication in a special issue of the British Medical Journal. If any of you are reviewers, we would love to hear what you think about it, and I hope that you'll review it positively. So this is very quickly a summary of the 28 separate and unique tactics that we identified as being used by these 5 industries. And I'm not going to go over any of them in detail, but I imagine just by scrolling through this list, you probably have an industry that is one that you're particularly interested in, or an organization, or a manufacturing process. And you can start to think about how this checklist could be used to evaluate industries beyond the 5 that we've evaluated. This is a Venn diagram that summarizes the individual tactics. The numbers here correspond to a specific tactic. And you can see in the center, tactics 1, 2, 3, 8, and 21 are shared by all 5 of the industries. Other tactics like 20, 24, 22, and 25 are specific to 1 or only 2 industries. And I'll talk a little bit about what those are. So there are 5 essential ingredients. These are tactics that we found were used by all 5 of these incredibly diverse industries or organizations. One of them is attack study design. And here the purpose is to take any result that seems to shed a harsh light on a product or an industry and identify its flaws. And every study has a flaw, every study has a limitation. Here you would make the flaws seem outsized compared to the true value of that study design. Tactic 2 is gain support from reputable individuals. So find people who appear to have certain kinds of credentials and get them to defend a product so that you can gain broader support from the medical community, the public, or the scientific community. Number 3 is misrepresent data. So you can design a study to get the result that you want, to suggest that a product is not harmful, by contaminating all of the samples, or by altering some mechanism within a study design. Or you can misrepresent data by only identifying data that support the hypothesis that you're trying to present. The 4th tactic is employ hyperbolic language. Talk about things in absolutist terms, when really science has a lot of gray area. You instead say that things are either right or they're wrong. Using hyperbole, using terms like sound science or junk science. This is all hyperbolic language. And the 5th one is actively influence the government or laws. So even good industries want to do this. Here we're talking about an inappropriate proximity to a regulatory body as a way to encourage policy or discourage the actual implementation or accountability in policies that exist. Again, there's 6 other tactics that are used by 4 out of the 5 industries, like suppress actually incriminating information, move the goalposts about how a measurement or an outcome or an exposure should be measured, contribute literature that's actually misleading. So get stuff into the peer-reviewed literature as a way to alter what feels like the balance of evidence. Take advantage of scientific illiteracy. So use terms that are not accessible to the people that you're talking to, talk over people's heads, manipulate people's lack of knowledge about a certain topic. Pose as the defender of health or truth. So several industries basically have put themselves out there as, you know, academic scientists are lying to you. They need to lie to you as a way to get grant money. We're the ones who are actually going to tell you the truth. And then blame other causes. Those are all effective ways of manufacturing doubt. We identified only 4 tactics that, to our knowledge, are unique to a single industry of the 5 that we looked at. And we don't actually think that they're truly unique to those industries, but we could only find primary literature for one of the industries. So alter your product to seem healthier. This is something that the tobacco industry did. They talked about making a safer cigarette. And the sugar industry in some ways has tried to do this by using sugar substitutes, but sugar substitutes substitutes aren't exactly the same thing. So we didn't think that that was appropriate to count for the sugar industry. Inappropriately questioned causality. This is something that the tobacco industry wrote about, that they were going to fight public knowledge by continuing to claim that you couldn't show causality in humans unless you do a randomized controlled trial. Attack opponents, that seems like something that would be pretty easy to do, and yet personal attacks, for example, on scientists, is something we only saw documented in the case of Syngenta against Tyrone Hayes. And making straw man arguments. Again, I'm going to guess that some of these other industries have done it. We just didn't see documentation of it. But one thing that the Marshall Institute did about climate change is to claim that the IPCC, which is the international organization that draws consensus statements about climate change, they claimed that the IPCC said that climate change was you know, the worst possible thing that's going to happen to humanity. I'm paraphrasing a little bit here. And then they use that to say, see how extreme they are. But the IPCC never said that. That's beyond the scope of what they would have said. Perhaps what's most interesting is that we identified 10 tactics, and I'm showing you only 5 here as an example, that rely on the use of logical fallacies. And so this is a logical fallacy. This was new to me to sort of think about. A logical fallacy is sort of a framework by which critical thinking is lost or not used, where logical thinking is lost or not used. And again, for anyone who's at all interested in this, there's some great websites, including some academic sites that have assembled. In fact, Wikipedia, which I don't normally recommend that students use, is a great resource to read. There's dozens of these different kinds of logical fallacies. And we found that many of the tactics that have been used, of those 28, at least 10 of them rely on the use of a logical fallacy. We also really were interested in whether these tactics that are used are really aimed at specific audiences, or are they generally or broadly useful? And by looking at the tactics, what we identified is that there's often four audiences that are targeted. So you might be trying to change how the judicial or the legal system handles evaluations, regulations. You might be trying to change the political or government system to alter the shaping of a regulation, the setting of a policy. You might be trying to change what the lay public thinks about your product, or what they think about hazard, or what they think about you know, scientific academic studies. Or you might be trying to influence the scientific or medical community by, say, setting a new standard by which you would evaluate studies or evaluate study quality. So what did we learn by doing this sort of systematic evaluation and identification of these 28 tactics? The first thing was that there are a lot of these tactics, and we imagine that as time goes on and industries continue to identify creative ways to manipulate public opinion, there will become even more tactics to manufacture doubt. But we were surprised to identify 28 unique tactics. We do think that a core set of these appear to be essential. So it's helpful for us when we're looking at novel cases to be able to determine, is this just a case of true scientific dispute? Is this a case of, there's lots of things where genuine scientific disagreement occurs, and that's helpful and that's healthy. And this can help to separate out where if we're seeing these same tactics showing up, it builds a stronger case that manufactured doubt is occurring. And we want to be very clear that we don't think that what people should do is to take these 28 tactics and tick them off and say, okay, this industry has done 6 of them and this industry has done 20 of them, so the second industry is worse than the first. It's not that kind of tool, but it helps to build the case that, that someone is manipulating public opinion, or an industry is manipulating public opinion. We do think that there might be some unique tactics that are being created by industries because of the unique features of those industries. For example, the coal industry really does have regulations that are specific to its own pollution of the people who work within that industry. So there are going to be tactics that are very specific in those cases, but we think that those unique tactics are going to be in the minority. And we also think that identifying tactics that are selected by industries can help us determine who are they trying to influence. And also, if you know who they're trying to influence, you might be able to predict what kind of tactics they use. So we expect there will be a bi-directional relationship between the tactic and the audience that's being targeted. Again, I think this concept of logical fallacies is so interesting because I'm trained as a scientist. I'm a bench scientist by training, and learning to identify what is a gap in logic is part of scientific training, although not many of us, I have never been formally trained in how to do so. There's a great quote from this Casadevall and Fang piece published in 2016 that says that training in critical thinking and avoiding illogical thought patterns is needed because these illogical thought patterns come naturally to humans. We're prone towards logical fallacies, and we need to actually be trained to reject them. And yet old studies, so studies from the 1980s suggest that even well scientists will perform poorly on tests that evaluate straightforward logical relationships. So even those of us that are trained to avoid logical fallacies will fall for them a good percentage of the time. And that's concerning because that means that they can be used to manipulate public opinion. We also wanted to evaluate who can manufacture doubt. So is someone who has a blog online, but isn't connected directly to the industry, isn't actually making any profit off of the industry, are they manufacturing doubt, or are they doing something else? And we think that it's important to distinguish between those who are manufacturing doubt and those who are perpetuating doubt. I think the vaccine debate is an example of this, where I'm not really certain of, in many cases, who's manufacturing the doubt. It could be people who are patenting tests to create separate vaccines for people. Those would certainly be individuals who would have a vested interest in manufacturing doubt. But a lot of the anti-vaccine community, or the vaccine denialist, or the vaccine wary community, they're not actually manufacturing doubt. They're perpetuating doubt. They're sharing that unscientific or illogical knowledge in a way that perpetuates it to new communities. The other thing that we have found very interesting is that in the 5 cases that we looked at, the government is never a manufacturer of doubt. But this does not mean that government agencies could not manufacture doubt. And in fact, we can think of examples of places where government groups have contaminated areas and then fought the cleanup, or have fought advocate groups that have claimed that the chemicals deposited there by our own government or by our military are hazardous. In this case, the government could be a manufacturer of doubt. We hope that this tool, once it's fully published and you can read it and go through it, will be useful, not just for looking backwards in time, as we did here for 5 cases that are fairly well documented, but looking forward at emerging issues in public health and environmental health to evaluate whether new industries are also using these same tactics. We think that this tool can be used to highlight where manufactured doubt starts being used, to inoculate people against its use, and also as a way to push back against industries that think that they can get away with it. So I do want to thank Rebecca Goldberg, who is really the lead on a lot of this work, and my former student, a graduate now of our graduate program in epidemiology here at UMass Amherst, as well as the rest of the members of my lab who've really been instrumental in how we talk and think about these different issues. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
Oh, thank you very much, Laura. That was an excellent presentation. And I think a lot of people on the call and others are going to find this extremely useful. My question for you is whether scientists who are bearing the brunt of many of the adverse effects of creating doubt are working in any kind of collaborative way to counteract the use of the tools, some of the tools you listed, to create or perpetuate doubt. What can scientists do, and what might you all be doing together?
Right. Yeah, I think one of the first things that needs to be done is even to just combat some of the language that has been used to make scientists fearful of talking about these issues. So a lot of scientists are afraid that they'll be labeled an advocate if we talk about these things. And frankly, I think that a term like advocate, it's again one of those sort of hyperbolic terms that's used to try to dismiss those as you have a vested interest in some outcome here. And for those of you who are actual advocates, I'm sure that it's sort of offensive to you that the idea that because you're an advocate, it means you shouldn't get a say in some decisions. That's sort of ridiculous on the face of itself. But it's also a term that's used as a weapon. And I think scientists need to push back against that. And we also need to push back against the idea that talking about these things does not actually make us less of scientists. It makes us more sort of educated scientists. And so I do advocate. I advocate for the use of science in decision making. I advocate for the use of evidence in decision making. That's what I'm advocating for, just as industry representatives are advocating for a position. So, you know, I think part of what we need to do is take back our power and participate in these conversations, because those of us who are on the ground are probably the most capable of saying, okay, yeah, there's data out there, but are those sound data? Are those data that are produced using the appropriate methods? And when we evaluate the data that are available, what conclusion can we draw?
Okay, we're running out of time.
Yeah.
But I've got a couple quick questions here just from Catherine Dodd. The telecom industry meets all your tactics. Thanks for the heads up. FCC government agency is captured and manufactures and perpetuates that for sure. How do we stop it? They own the media that we need to communicate with.
Yeah, I mean, one thing to do is to develop scientific literature that summarizes this. So, you know, pairing up with someone who writes scientific literature for a living, like I do. I don't work on telecom stuff. I don't know anything about that. But you need to pair up with experts who can help to dissect this example, because there will be media that's interested in this. And like the print media is absolutely interested in this kind of work.
Okay, and one more quick question, probably not so quick actually, from Sarah Howard. Have you looked at the strength of evidence and data for things like tobacco and compared that to the strength of evidence for current issues like BPA or EDCs? It'd be interesting to know how these things were overcome. Tobacco was eventually overcome. What was it? The strength of evidence got stronger, or what was it? What changed?
It's a great question, Sarah. So I think part of the problem is, how do we even define strength of evidence, right? Do we count studies? Do we count how many people were involved in studies? Do we rate different study designs in different ways? So I think it's really complicated. So I have not looked at that. I love that idea. In fact, I'm going to take a screen capture of this question that you just wrote so that I can remember to think about it later.
Okay, thanks very much. I think I need to turn this call back over to Hannah to do a formal close and address the issue of how these questions might be answered offline. So Hannah, and thanks a lot, Laura. This was terrific.
Great. Thank you so much, Cheryl, and to Dr. Vandenberg for your talk today. We're approaching the end of today's webinar. A video recording will be available on CHE's website soon, and tomorrow you'll receive an email containing a link to the video. Next week, CHE will be hosting the first webinar in our newest series, Cancer and the Environment: Science and Opportunities for Prevention. Join us on February 19th for our series launch, Multifactorial Origins of Cancer, Case Studies of Environmental Chemicals and Cancer Risks, and a Systems Approach to Prevention. To learn more and to RSVP, please visit our website at healthandenvironment.org. If you are new to CHE and would like to stay updated about upcoming events or more, please sign up to receive our newsletter by selecting the Join Us tab at the top of any page on our website. Partnership webinars bringing you the latest environmental health research for free. We encourage you to support CHE's ongoing work by making a tax-deductible donation via our secure website. Again, our website is healthandenvironment.org. With that, I would like to thank our speaker, Dr. Vandenberg, for taking time today to present with us, and to Cheryl for your excellent moderation. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great day.